The fatal miscalculation. He stood in the command tent, the damp fabric fluttering in the wind. The sound of distant artillery rolled like thunder across the valley. Maps were pinned on the wooden table, corners curling from the humidity, lines drawn in red pencil bleeding into the paper. His name was whispered with respect across every campfire on the Western Front. General Edward Somerset, Britain's golden tactician. But on this morning, even his confidence looked fragile. The plan had seemed perfect the night before. A flanking maneuver meant to break the enemy's left line. Swift, decisive, clean, he'd said. Yet as dawn crept through the smoke, nothing about the battle looked clean. Messengers stumbled into the tent, faces pale, words broken. The left division had moved too early. The artillery never fired the covering barrage, and the signal flags, the very lifeline of communication, were lost in the fog. He gripped the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the map as if staring could change the outcome. He'd calculated everything except the chaos of war itself. One order, a simple advance, had turned into a massacre. Hundreds of British soldiers trapped in open ground, machine gun fire cutting through mud and bodies alike. Outside, officers shouted for reinforcements. Inside, the general stood frozen, realizing he'd become the architect of his own disaster. The man who'd built his career on precision had just witnessed the collapse of it. And though the world would later call it a tactical error, the men who survived knew it as betrayal. By noon, the valley was silent again. The enemy had stopped firing. There was nothing left to shoot at. Somerset removed his gloves, now stained with dirt and blood, and whispered something no one heard. A confession, perhaps, or a vow. For the first time in his career, he understood that leadership wasn't about medals or maps. It was about the weight of a single decision, the kind that could change history or end it in an instant. That day, a legend fell. But from the ruins of his mistake, a new kind of British warfare would begin. One born not from pride, but from pain. Before the world knew his failure, they knew his brilliance. He was the son of a schoolteacher from Wiltshire, raised on stories of Waterloo and the pride of the British flag. His name was Edward Somerset, a man born with discipline in his bones and ambition in his eyes. At 17, he joined the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. By 25, he was already a decorated officer in colonial campaigns where the sun burned hotter than the bullets. By 25, he was already a decorated officer in colonial campaigns where the sun burned hotter than the bullets. Somerset's rise was meteoric. His superiors called him the Iron Brain of Britain for his calm under pressure and mathematical precision in planning battles. He had the rare gift of turning maps into victories. Every movement, every maneuver, every inch of terrain, all calculated like a game of chess, he always won. But somewhere along that climb, the confidence that once guided him began to harden into something else: pride. By the time the Great War erupted, Somerset had become more than a general. He was a symbol of British excellence. Men saluted him with reverence, not routine. Newspapers printed his speeches. Even the Prime Minister once said, "If anyone can bring order to this chaos, it's General Somerset." He was the man Britain trusted when the world began to crumble. But with that trust came unbearable pressure. Every loss was personal, every delay political, every order watched by men who had never seen mud, blood, or death up close. In meetings, Somerset's voice carried authority. But in private, his letters told another story. Of sleepless nights, of doubt, of a man haunted by his own reputation. He feared one thing more than the enemy: failure. So when the war demanded speed, he didn't hesitate. He signed the order that would send thousands forward, confident his plan was flawless. And as the first shells thundered across the horizon, he believed he was witnessing another triumph. He didn't know that, within hours, that same decision would make him the most questioned man in the British Army. Orders from the top war had its own hierarchy of fear. The soldiers feared bullets, the generals feared failure, and men like Edward Somerset feared London. Behind every frontline decision stood a wall of telegrams, cables, and voices, each one demanding victory, none understanding the cost. The War Office had turned into a theater of expectations. Politicians in pressed suits debated strategies drawn on polished tables, while Somerset's men dug trenches with frozen hands. Every morning reports from Downing Street arrived with the same urgency. Advance, hold, win. They didn't ask how, they simply ordered it. One minister even wrote, "Britain cannot afford hesitation. Our people need triumphs, not explanations." Somerset read those words in silence, knowing that in the comfort of London, a line written in ink could erase 100 lives in mud. He'd begun to sense it, the widening gap between command and reality. His officers whispered about it too. The generals plan wars. The soldiers survive them. But Somerset wasn't like the others. He believed he could balance both worlds, strategy and sacrifice, until one night a sealed message arrived. It came directly from the Chief of Staff. An order to launch an offensive within 48 hours. No reconnaissance, no updated maps, and barely any artillery support. It came directly from the Chief of Staff. An order to launch an offensive within 48 hours. No reconnaissance, no updated maps, and barely any artillery support. The line simply read, "Proceed as planned. Time is not on our side." Somerset stared at the paper for hours. He knew the terrain was a nightmare. Open fields, fog, and rivers that swallowed horses whole. But disobedience meant disgrace, perhaps dismissal. So he nodded, signed the papers, and sent his aides away. For the first time his command felt heavier than his uniform. That night, as wind battered the tent and the rain seeped through the canvas, he wrote a single line in his journal. "They fight their wars with words. I fight mine with ghosts." At dawn, the orders were carried to every battalion. Within a day, men would march into the valley that would define and destroy their commander. The decision was made. The battle had begun long before the first shot was fired. The morning of the attack was unnaturally quiet. Even the birds seemed to sense what was coming. Fog rolled thick over the valley, swallowing the trees, the trenches, the faces of men waiting for the signal to move. General Somerset stood on a low ridge, binoculars in hand, scanning the gray emptiness. He'd given the order at dawn. "Advance at 0600. The artillery will open first." But as the clock ticked, the sky stayed silent. No thunder, no barrage, no signal of support. Then, through the mist, movement. Dozens of British helmets glinted faintly as soldiers began to climb the ridge. They thought the guns had already fired, that the assault had begun. But the artillery officers, lost in the fog 2 miles back, were still waiting for confirmation. The front line had misread a flare, the wrong color, the wrong timing, and now hundreds were walking straight into enemy fire. Somerset shouted for the signalman, ordered the retreat flags raised, but the wind carried nothing. The valley had turned into a graveyard of echoes. And then came the sound. The first German machine gun opening from the tree line. 1, then 10, then an entire wall of fire. Men dropped before they even saw who was shooting. Mud erupted around them like shattered earth. Somerset could see the chaos unfold, could see his line dissolving. He wanted to stop it, to call it back, but communication lines were already cut. Every wire, every flag, every signal was swallowed by smoke and confusion. His strategy, the perfect geometry of maps and timing, had been undone by something no chart could capture. Chance. Thread and aide rushed to him, face white, uniform soaked. His strategy, the perfect geometry of maps and timing, had been undone by something no chart could capture. Chance. An aide rushed to him, face white, uniform soaked. "Sir, the left flank is gone." "They're trapped." Somerset didn't answer. He just watched. He'd built this plan with precision, and now he was watching it burn. Within 40 minutes, the assault was over. The valley that once promised victory now lay silent under the morning fog. Hundreds of British bodies lay scattered across the mud, their rifles still clutched like questions never answered. And as the smoke cleared, Somerset finally understood. The enemy wasn't just across the field. It was within the orders, the pride, and the silence that led them there. When the guns finally fell silent, the valley looked like it had never known life. Smoke drifted low across the ground, blurring the line between mud and blood. Medics moved like ghosts, searching for signs of breath where none remained. The assault that was meant to win ground had instead erased it. News traveled faster than recovery. By dusk, field couriers had carried the disaster back to headquarters, and by nightfall, it reached London. At first, the reports were softened. Unexpected resistance, heavy fog, temporary setback. But the numbers couldn't be hidden for long. Over 800 men, gone in less than an hour. It was the kind of figure that didn't just mark a failure. It demanded a culprit. In the War Office, generals whispered behind closed doors. Some blamed miscommunication, others blamed fate. But the public wanted a name, and General Edward Somerset became the face of the tragedy. Newspapers that once praised him now tore his reputation apart. "Somerset's Folly," one headline read. Another called it, "The Cost of Arrogance." For the first time in his career, Somerset avoided the mirror. He couldn't bear to see the man history was already rewriting. His letters from those days were short, sometimes only a single sentence. "They followed my orders. I led them wrong." He was recalled from the front for strategic review, a phrase that sounded professional but felt like punishment. His uniform still carried mud from the battlefield when he arrived at Whitehall for questioning. A board of officers, men younger and less battle-tested than him, asked cold, rehearsed questions. Why did you advance without confirmation? Why didn't you halt the attack? Why didn't you wait? He didn't defend himself. He simply said, "Because they told me to move, and I believed I was right." It was an answer that satisfied no one. For outside, the city moved on. It was an answer that satisfied no one. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, Somerset carried a silence heavier than any metal. The war would continue, but for him, the fighting had already changed. It was no longer between nations. It was between a man and his own conscience. For the first time in 20 years, Edward Somerset found himself without a command. No maps, no briefings, no waiting soldiers, only silence. The corridors of the War Office no longer echoed his footsteps. The same officers who once stood to salute him now looked away. In the newspapers, his name vanished as if erased by design. He was sent to an advisory post in the countryside, a polite exile, a large estate converted into a temporary headquarters, where nothing truly happened. He spent his mornings reading reports from the front, his evenings staring at the same oak tree outside his window. Every day felt like a reminder that his war had ended, but not his punishment. He stopped wearing his medals, stopped attending meetings, and began writing instead, not orders, but reflections. Long pages of notes and self-criticism that no one was meant to read. In one of his surviving letters, he wrote, "I used to believe war was a matter of will and precision, but war is chaos dressed in uniform." He reread the battle reports hundreds of times, trying to understand where logic had turned into tragedy. Was it the fog? The signal? The arrogance? Or the silence between orders? The answer, he realized, was all of it. And him most of all. Months turned into years. Outside, the war raged on with new names, new generals, new mistakes. But Somerset remained in his quiet post, rebuilding not an army, but his understanding of what leadership truly meant. He began studying old campaigns, Marlborough, Wellington, even Napoleon, not for their victories, but for their failures. He underlined one line from Wellington's diary. "The hardest lesson for a commander is to know when not to fight." Each word felt personal, each sentence like a message sent across centuries. By winter of 1916, something in him had changed. The pride that once drove him had cooled into discipline. The silence that haunted him had turned into clarity. He wasn't ready to command again, not yet. But deep inside, a new kind of general was taking shape, one born not from triumph, but from truth. Rebuilding a reputation war doesn't forgive easily, and neither does history. But by 1917, both were running out of men who understood them. Britain was exhausted. The endless mud, the mounting losses, the generals cycling through hope and despair. Somewhere in a quiet office, a familiar name appeared again on the reassignment list. Edward Somerset. Not as commander of a division, but as an advisor to a newly formed training corps. It wasn't glory, it was rehabilitation. Yet Somerset accepted it without hesitation. He knew that redemption rarely comes with applause. He arrived at the camp in a modest car without an escort, wearing a plain uniform. The young officers didn't recognize him. To them, he was just another senior figure with tired eyes. But when he spoke during the first briefing, something about his tone silenced the room. It wasn't commanding. It was careful, measured, human. He began teaching what no manual could: restraint, patience, humility. Orders, he told them, are easy to give. Understanding what they'll cost is harder. His lectures became quiet lessons in survival, not just strategy. He showed recruits how to read terrain, not just maps, how to trust instinct, not ego. Within months, his methods reached the front lines through those very officers. Reports spoke of small units maneuvering smarter, conserving lives, communicating better. No one mentioned his name, but his philosophy had begun to spread like an unseen reform. One evening, a colonel from headquarters visited the camp. He watched Somerset training a group of young soldiers, personally correcting their drills in the rain. Afterward, the colonel said, "You could be leading men again, General." Somerset paused, looking at the horizon where storm clouds gathered. "I am," he replied quietly, "just not the same way I used to." His comeback didn't happen in one grand victory. It happened in dozens of small lessons. In every soldier who learned to think before charging, to question before obeying, to survive before celebrating. Britain had given him another chance, but it wasn't forgiveness he wanted. It was purpose. And this time he wasn't fighting for medals. He was fighting to make sure no one repeated his mistake. By 1918, the war had entered its most brutal phase. The trenches had become endless scars across Europe, lines of death that refused to move. But within that hopeless grid of mud and wire, General Edward Somerset saw something others didn't: a pattern. He'd studied every report, every failed offensive, every desperate retreat. He realized the enemy wasn't just the opposing army. It was predictability. The British command had been fighting the same war, the same way again and again, waiting for a different outcome. So Somerset proposed something radical: a new strategy built on adaptability, communication, and precision intelligence. He scrapped rigid timetables and replaced them with flexible command structures. He introduced real-time field coordination, officers carrying portable radio sets, scouts transmitting signals instead of relying on flares and guesswork. He prioritized information over impulse. Victory, he told his staff, is not about who fires first. It's about who learns faster. At first, the War Office dismissed him. They called his methods theory born from failure. But when small units began succeeding under his model, skepticism turned into quiet curiosity. He trained commanders to think in layers, to strike fast, withdraw smarter, and re-engage only when the field favored them. He reorganized supply chains so soldiers received food and ammunition with precision timing, not bureaucratic delay. Even the medics noticed the difference. Fewer men were dying because fewer were being wasted. The press didn't notice it at first, because success rarely makes headlines when it's slow and methodical. But on the ground, soldiers began calling it Somerset's method. Not a tactic, a mindset. He no longer saw war as a contest of courage. He saw it as a conversation between chaos and control. And this time he was finally listening. By late 1918, British units under his advisory model were achieving breakthroughs once thought impossible. It wasn't victory in the traditional sense, no parades, no flags, but it was the first real sign of evolution. Somerset had rewritten how Britain fought, not through power but through patience, not through pride but through understanding. 1918. The war was breathing its last, but no one knew it yet. Both sides were desperate, one fighting to advance, the other to endure. In northern France, British intelligence reported an enemy buildup near the Somme, a strike that could tear through the line and open the road to Paris. The command was paralyzed. Every general had a plan, and every plan looked the same: defend, counter, repeat. Then, in that silence of uncertainty, one voice spoke up: General Edward Somerset. He proposed a strategy unlike anything the staff had seen before, a deliberate retreat, a feigned weakness, to draw the enemy into a false advance where precision artillery and hidden flanks would crush them in motion. It was risky, unorthodox, and deeply personal. He called it controlled chaos. Many doubted him. One officer whispered, "Isn't this the same man who led us into the valley?" Somerset heard it, and simply replied, "Yes, that's why I won't make the same mistake twice." The operation began under moonlight. British forces withdrew in measured silence, leaving decoy trenches and false positions. The enemy took the bait, marching confidently into what they believed was victory. At dawn, Somerset gave the order, one word over the wireless. "Now." Yabion. What followed was swift, surgical, and brutal. The artillery opened not on static targets, but on moving columns, coordinated by forward observers and real-time signals. For the first time in years, British fire was faster than German movement. The flanks closed like iron jaws. By dusk, the enemy line had shattered. Thousands surrendered, their commanders stunned by how precisely the trap had been set. In London, the reports came through. Enemy repelled with minimal losses. Counterattack successful. No glory, no headlines. Just efficiency. But for Somerset, it was something far greater. He didn't celebrate. He simply removed his gloves, looked at the field, and whispered the same words he'd once written in his journal. "They fight their wars with words. I fight mine with ghosts." This time, the ghosts were finally at peace. Learned when the guns of Europe finally fell silent, the war ended. But for General Edward Somerset, silence had a different meaning. It wasn't peace. It was memory. He returned to England without ceremony. No parades, no crowds, no speeches. He returned to England without ceremony. No parades, no crowds, no speeches. Just a quiet train ride through towns that had given too much and received too little. For most people, his name had faded into history's background noise. But among soldiers, it was spoken with a kind of respect that couldn't be written in medals. Somerset refused further promotions. He spent his final years teaching at the Staff College, guiding a new generation of officers who had never seen the chaos of trench warfare. He told them that strategy was not about bravery or luck. It was about responsibility. Every line on a map, he'd say, represents someone's son. Those who studied under him noticed something rare. He never spoke of victory, only survival. He reminded them that leadership wasn't about being followed. It was about being understood. Historians later called him the architect of modern British warfare. But Somerset never saw himself as a reformer. He saw himself as a man who'd learned too late what war truly costs. In his final letter, written weeks before his death, he left a single line for the Army archives. "The strength of a commander lies not in his certainty, but in his doubt, for only doubt makes him listen." When his belongings were collected, they found one map from the valley, folded, faded, edges torn. Across it, in red pencil, he'd written one word: remember. Today his name rests quietly among the others who shaped Britain's wars. But his legacy isn't carved on a monument. It lives in the doctrines, the training manuals, and the lessons whispered to every new officer before their first command. Because every war leaves behind two kinds of soldiers, those who win battles and those who learn from them. Somerset was both, and history, in its quietest moments, still listens to men like him.